On the stages of New York and the silent screens of early Hollywood, Alla Nazimova was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just an actress, she was a force. Known for her intensity and daring choices, she quickly rose to fame. But her influence reached far beyond the spotlight. Nazimova quietly coined the phrase "sewing circle," a discreet network of lesbian, bisexual, and curious women in Hollywood. At a time when the industry demanded silence, she created a hidden community where stars could live a fragment of their truth behind closed doors. Her estate on Sunset Boulevard became the legendary Garden of Alla. At first, it was her private villa, a sanctuary where artists and outsiders could gather without judgment. Later transformed into a hotel, it became a haven for actors, writers, and free spirits who didn't fit Hollywood's mold. Stories of wild parties and clandestine romances soon turned it into a myth, a place where the rules of the outside world were suspended. Nazimova herself lived boldly for her time. She supported and nurtured younger actresses, offering guidance and shelter within the circle she created. From 1929 until her death in 1945, she shared her life with her partner Gleska Marshall, a devotion she never denied, even if the world refused to recognize it. In an industry built on illusion, Alla Nazimova dared to make something real. She wasn't just a star, she was the architect of a hidden world where women could breathe freely, if only for a moment. Her legacy lives on not only in film history, but in the whispered courage of those who followed her path. To understand why Alla Nazimova matters, we have to look beyond the credits of her films. In the 1,910 seconds and 1,920 seconds, she was already one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood, with her name glowing on marquees from New York to Los Angeles. But fame was only part of her story. Nazimova's life became a mirror of the contradictions that defined Hollywood itself, dazzling on the surface, yet filled with hidden currents beneath. At a time when women in the industry were expected to smile sweetly and follow rules written for them, Nazimova pushed boundaries at every turn. She produced and wrote films when female voices were rarely invited into those roles. She hosted artists, writers, and lovers at her Sunset Boulevard villa, transforming it into a haven for those who didn't quite belong to polite society. And while Hollywood preached morality codes and clean reputations, Nazimova was quietly nurturing a secret network of women who dared to love each other in silence. Her story matters today because it reveals how much strength it took to live authentically in a world built on illusion. She was more than a starlet of the silent screen. She was a woman who built a hidden world, a safe harbor, at enormous personal cost. In the chapters that follow, we'll explore 10 moments, 10 pieces of her journey that together reveal how Alla Nazimova became not only a legend of early cinema, but also the beating heart of Hollywood's most secret circle. Alla Nazimova's journey began far from the glittering lights of Hollywood. Born in Yalta, on the Crimean coast, she grew up in a world marked by both hardship and imagination. Her childhood was turbulent, shaped by a fractured family and a restless spirit that never seemed to fit neatly into expectations. But even as a young girl, she carried a presence that demanded attention, a gaze that hinted at storms within. Drawn to the stage, Nazimova found her first true escape in the theater. She trained in Moscow under the legendary Konstantin Stanislavski, absorbing his revolutionary methods of performance. Where others recited lines, she lived them. Her ability to dissolve into characters made her a sensation in Russian theater. And soon, she dreamed of a stage larger than any in her homeland. By the early 1,900 seconds, she had crossed oceans to America. On Broadway, Nazimova's intensity was unlike anything audiences had seen. Her performances were raw, fearless, almost unsettling in their realism. Critics hailed her as a revelation, while theatergoers packed houses to witness the foreign actress whose every movement seemed charged with electricity. These early years shaped the woman she would become, fiercely independent, unafraid of risk, unwilling to be molded. Long before she coined the phrase "sewing circle" or opened the Garden of Alla, Nazimova had already proven she was a force who would not be contained. The girl from Yalta had become a star, and Hollywood was the next stage waiting to be conquered. When Alla Nazimova arrived in Hollywood, she carried with her the aura of Broadway triumphs and the discipline of Stanislavski's stage. Silent film was still young, hungry for faces that could project entire worlds without a word, and Nazimova's expressive eyes and commanding presence made her unforgettable. By the late 1910 seconds, she was one of the highest-paid actresses in the industry, drawing salaries that rivaled her male counterparts, an extraordinary feat for a woman at that time. Films like Revelation, 1918, and Stronger Than Death, 1920, showcased her ability to embody characters with intensity and nuance. Critics praised her as magnetic, audiences flocked to see her, and studios hailed her as a new kind of star, one who carried the gravitas of theater into the shimmering dreamscape of cinema. Yet, even at the height of her fame, Nazimova was never content to remain only an actress. She negotiated creative control, producing and writing her own films, making decisions usually reserved for men in power. For a brief, brilliant moment, she seemed unstoppable, an immigrant woman not only succeeding but shaping the course of American cinema itself. Still, Hollywood's love was fickle. Her bold artistic experiments, such as her lavish and avant-garde adaptation of Salome, 1923, dazzled some but baffled many. Audiences accustomed to conventional storytelling were not ready for her symbolism and stylized vision. The same independence that made her extraordinary on screen also set her apart from an industry that demanded conformity. Nazimova's rise in silent Hollywood was dazzling but precarious. She had claimed the spotlight on her own terms, but the seeds of her eventual struggles were already sown. For every triumph, there would be a price, and soon she would learn just how high that cost could be. By the mid-1920 seconds, Alla Nazimova's film career had begun to cool. The daring experiments that once set her apart now left her at odds with the studios. But where others might have faded quietly, Nazimova reinvented herself not on the screen, but on Sunset Boulevard. She transformed her sprawling Mediterranean-style estate into a sanctuary. At first, it was simply her home, a villa filled with laughter, music, and long nights of conversation. But as her circle of artists and outsiders grew, the estate took on a new identity: the Garden of Allah. In 1926, she converted the property into a hotel, and almost overnight, it became one of the most legendary addresses in Hollywood. The Garden of Allah was more than a glamorous hideaway. It was a refuge for those who didn't fit the mold, actors weary of studio control, writers chasing freedom, and women whose loves could not be named in public. Beneath its palm trees and archways, boundaries blurred, parties spilled into dawn, ideas clashed and mingled, and lives unfolded with a candor impossible outside its walls. Stories from the garden soon became part of Hollywood folklore. F. Scott Fitzgerald stayed there while writing. Dorothy Parker found both inspiration and despair within its rooms. And always at the center was Nazimova, presiding like a matriarch of misfits, her villa transformed into a mythic stage where freedom briefly eclipsed fear. For a city built on illusion, the Garden of Allah was startlingly real, a place where masks could slip, if only for a night. And it ensured that even as Nazimova's star dimmed on screen, her legend off-screen only grew brighter. In the Hollywood of the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds, secrecy was survival. Studios dictated everything from the cut of a gown to the shape of a star's private life. For women who loved other women, exposure meant scandal, ruined contracts, or exile from the screen. Yet in this climate of silence, Alla Nazimova planted the seeds of something daring, a hidden network that came to be known as the sewing circle. On the surface, the phrase sounded harmless: ladies gathered for needlework, gossip, and tea. But in truth, it was code. Beneath that gentle cover, the sewing circle connected some of Hollywood's most luminous names: Greta Garbo, Barbara Stanwyck, Marlene Dietrich, Tallulah Bankhead, and many more. Within this discreet sisterhood, women found what the outside world denied them: companionship, solidarity, and the chance to love without fear, if only behind closed doors. Nazimova was the quiet architect of this world, She opened her Garden of Allah as a meeting place, gave younger actresses guidance, and offered a model of courage, never flaunting her truth, but never fully hiding it either. By coining the phrase, she gave these women not only a name, but also a shared identity, something to cling to in an industry that insisted they did not exist. The sewing circle remained one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets for decades, whispered about but never printed. Yet its impact was profound. It allowed women to carve out lives on their own terms, to survive and even thrive in a system designed to erase them. And at its heart stood Alla Nazimova, a woman who turned secrecy into sanctuary. Behind Alla Nazimova's fierce independence was a trail of loves, some whispered, some celebrated, many remembered only in fragments of rumor. Each relationship carried both tenderness and risk, for in Hollywood's golden age, such bonds could never be spoken of aloud. Among the earliest was her companionship with Jean Acker, the silent film actress best known as the first wife of Rudolph Valentino. Their connection was brief but intense, a reminder that Nazimova's world was always filled with firebrands who defied convention. Later came the playwright and poet Mercedes de Acosta, a woman notorious for her affairs with some of the most dazzling stars of the century. Together, they shared not just passion but a common vision of living truthfully in a world that demanded lies. But perhaps her most enduring devotion was to Gleska Marshall, with whom she lived from 1929 until her death. Gleska was more than a partner. She was a steady anchor through the turbulence of Nazimova's later years. Where others drifted in and out of her orbit, Gleska remained, a constant presence at the Garden of Allah and in Nazimova's private heart. Yet love was rarely free of shadow. Each relationship carried the weight of secrecy. The tension of lives lived in partial light. Friends spoke of her generosity, her intensity, her refusal to apologize for her affections. To be loved by Nazimova was to be swept into a current both intoxicating and dangerous. These romances, stitched together in rumor and memory, reveal a woman who refused to live loveless, even when the price was high. In the end, Nazimova's loves were as bold as her art, unconventional, passionate, and utterly her own. At the height of her fame, Alla Nazimova seemed untouchable, an actress who had conquered Broadway, electrified silent cinema, and even commanded her own productions. But Hollywood is a place where brilliance is often punished when it refuses to conform. For Nazimova, the breaking point came with her boldest gamble, the 1923 film Salome. Lavish, experimental, and deeply symbolic, Salome was unlike anything audiences had seen. With its stylized sets inspired by Aubrey Beardsley's illustrations and its daring, almost surreal atmosphere, the film was more art piece than mainstream entertainment. Critics didn't know what to do with it. Audiences, expecting conventional melodrama, recoiled. The movie flopped spectacularly, and the failure branded Nazimova reckless and unmarketable. For a woman who had once been among the highest-paid stars in Hollywood, the fall was swift and merciless. Studios stopped calling. Investors, once eager to back her projects, disappeared. Her independence, the very trait that had made her extraordinary, now made her dangerous in an industry that thrived on predictability. The financial loss was devastating, forcing Nazimova to sell much of what she owned. More painful still was the loss of her creative power. Hollywood, a town she had helped shape, turned its back on her with the same speed it had once embraced her. Yet, even in decline, Nazimova never bowed. She poured her energy into the Garden of Allah, into the hidden network of the sewing circle, into nurturing others whose voices might otherwise have been silenced. Though her star dimmed on screen, her influence only deepened off it. Her fall from stardom was not an end, but a transformation. Nazimova moved from being Hollywood's darling to becoming its hidden heartbeat, the woman who lost the spotlight but built a legend. By the late 1920s, as Alla Nazimova's film career slipped away, her Sunset Boulevard estate took on a new role. No longer just her private home, it became a refuge for the dreamers, the drifters, and the defiant. When she converted the property into a residential hotel in 1926, the Garden of Allah was born part sanctuary, part circus, and entirely unlike anything else in Hollywood. The garden quickly attracted a constellation of names. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald nursed both manuscripts and hangovers by its pool. Dorothy Parker sharpened her wit under its palm trees. Actors between contracts, directors in exile, and hopeful newcomers all passed through its rooms. For many, it was a place where masks could slip, where the rules of studio morality didn't apply. But beyond the celebrity guests and decadent parties, the Garden of Alla was something more radical. It became a haven for outsiders, especially women of the sewing circle. Here, behind stucco walls and flowering gardens, they could gather without fear of headlines, loving freely if only for a fleeting night. The estate pulsed with an energy of liberation, a space where the forbidden became possible. Stories of its excesses became Hollywood legend, champagne-fueled nights that stretched until dawn, whispered romances hidden in shadowed corridors, and arguments about art and politics that felt like revolutions. Through it all, Nazimova reigned at the center, not as a fallen star, but as the matriarch of a community that refused to be erased. The Garden of Alla stood as her masterpiece, less a building than a living symbol of rebellion. Even as her name faded from marquees, Nazimova's legacy grew in every whispered story that passed through its gates. As the Garden of Alla thrived with its swirl of artists and outsiders, Alla Nazimova's own life grew quieter, steadier. At the center of this new chapter was Gleska Marshall, a woman who became not just her companion but her anchor. From 1929 until Nazimova's final days, the two shared their lives with a devotion that endured long after the glamour of stardom had faded. Marshall was younger, elegant, and deeply loyal. Friends who visited the garden often remarked on the easy tenderness between them, the way Nazimova's fire seemed calmed by Gleska's steady presence, the way Gleska protected her from the cruelties of gossip and the instability of a career in decline. In an era when the love between two women had to live in coded language and careful silences, their bond spoke for itself. While Nazimova's name slipped from marquee lights, she found contentment in the rhythms of a more private existence. She gardened, entertained, mentored younger artists, and drew strength from her partnership with Marshall. Together, they made a home not of glitter and applause, but of loyalty and quiet joy. When Nazimova's health declined in the 1,940 seconds, Gleska remained at her side, caring for her with unwavering devotion. To the outside world, they were close friends, but those who knew them understood the truth that theirs was a love story lived in the margins, dignified and unbroken. In the end, it was Gleska who carried Nazimova's memory forward, ensuring she was remembered not just as a daring actress, but as a woman who had lived bravely, passionately, and authentically. By the 1,940 seconds, the Garden of Alla still buzzed with stories, but Alla Nazimova herself was living in a quieter rhythm. Age and illness began to weigh on her once commanding frame, yet her spirit remained unbroken. She had long since ceased chasing the fickle promises of Hollywood. Instead, she poured her energy into the world she had built, mentoring young performers, offering guidance to friends, and leaning on the steadfast companionship of Gleska Marshall. Though her health faltered, Nazimova never surrendered her dignity. Visitors recalled her sharp eyes, still brimming with wit and mischief, and her ability to turn even the simplest afternoon conversation into theater. The glamour of her early career might have faded, but she carried herself with the same fearless honesty that had once electrified Broadway and Hollywood. She passed away in 1945, with Gleska at her side. To the outside world, the news was quiet, an obituary for a silent star whose name many younger filmgoers no longer recognized. But for those who knew her, her death marked the end of an era. Nazimova had not just acted on the stage and screen, she had carved hidden spaces for others to exist more freely, leaving behind a legacy whispered in confidences and celebrated in private circles. Her final years were not ones of grand premieres or bright lights. They were marked by loyalty, courage, and the quiet triumph of living authentically in a time that demanded masks. In her passing, she became more than a forgotten star. She became a legend of resistance, remembered by those who understood the true depth of her story. Alla Nazimova's name may not gleam as brightly as Garbo or Dietrich on the marquee of history, but her influence runs deeper than most realize. She was not only a star of the silent screen, but an architect of hidden Hollywood, a woman who built spaces, coined language, and modeled a kind of quiet courage that changed the lives of those around her. The sewing circle she named became a lifeline for countless women, a coded identity that allowed them to recognize one another in a world of secrecy. The Garden of Allah she created became more than a hotel. It was a sanctuary where outcasts, dreamers, and forbidden lovers could find, for a moment, freedom. These were not just places and words, they were acts of rebellion disguised as hospitality. Nazimova's films, though fewer remembered today, paved the way for actresses to demand creative control. Her avant-garde Salome would later be reclaimed as a queer classic, decades after it was dismissed as too strange, too daring. And her personal life, her loves, her defiance of convention, her refusal to live quietly, has inspired generations who saw in her a mirror of their own struggles. Her legacy is one of defiance wrapped in grace. In an industry built on illusion, she dared to make something real. And though Hollywood may have tried to forget her, every whispered story of the sewing circle, every legend of the Garden of Allah, carries her name forward. Alla Nazimova was more than an actress. She was a visionary, a woman who planted seeds of freedom in the most unlikely soil, ensuring that even in the shadows, truth could bloom. Hollywood's golden age is often remembered as a world of elegance, gowns glittering under arc lamps, studio contracts sealed in smoke-filled offices, premieres where flashbulbs turn night into day. But beneath that shimmering surface lived another Hollywood, one of shadows, secrets, and whispered truths. At the center of that hidden world was Alla Nazimova. Her career began in brilliance, from Moscow's stage to Broadway's spotlight, and finally to Hollywood's silent screens. She burned with a force audiences could not ignore. She was one of the highest-paid actresses of her time, a woman who claimed not just roles but authority in an industry reluctant to grant it. Yet Nazimova's true mark was not only in the films she made but in the spaces she built. The Garden of Allah was more than a hotel. It was a living symbol of freedom. Within its walls, boundaries blurred, masks slipped, and forbidden loves found a fleeting refuge. The sewing circle she named offered women in Hollywood a secret code, a way to recognize one another in an era when exposure meant ruin. In both her home and her language, Nazimova gave voice to lives that official Hollywood demanded remain silent. Her downfall, too, tells part of her story. Salome, the ambitious film that should have crowned her as a visionary, instead cost her career. But even as the studios turned their backs, she refused to vanish. She poured herself into her community, into mentorship, into living a life that, though quieter, was perhaps truer to her spirit. And at the core of it all was love. From fleeting romances to her enduring bond with Gleska Marshall, Nazimova lived as fully as she dared. She carried her affections with dignity, never flaunting them, never apologizing for them. In doing so, she became more than a star. She became a symbol of resilience. Today, her films may be studied by scholars, her garden long since demolished, her sewing circle spoken of in hushed admiration. Yet Nazimova's legacy remains vibrant. She proved that even in an age of rigid control and crushing silence, there were those who dared to carve out freedom. In remembering Alla Nazimova, we remember a woman who stood at the crossroads of illusion and truth, light and shadow. She was Hollywood royalty, yes, but she was also its rebel queen, the architect of a hidden world that still shapes how we see the golden age today. If Alla Nazimova's story has opened your eyes to the hidden chapters of Hollywood, remember this: history is not only written in bright lights, but also in the shadows. Nazimova was more than a silent film star. She was a pioneer who created safe spaces in a time when truth had to live in secret. Her Garden of Allah became a legend, her sewing circle a lifeline, and her courage a blueprint for those who came after. By revisiting her life, we honor not only her art but her defiance, the way she lived authentically even when the world demanded silence. And we keep alive the voices of countless others who, like her, dared to love and to live outside the mold. If this story moved you, help us carry it forward. Like this video, share it with those who love cinema history, and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter in our journey through classic Hollywood's untold truths. Each view, each comment, keeps these forgotten legends alive for a new generation. Hollywood's golden age may be gone, but its secrets still whisper. Stay with us, and together, we'll continue uncovering the light and the darkness behind the stars.